Greetings friends and welcome back to our digital workflow. In this episode, we're going to let Lightroom automatically generate a panoramic image using a multitude of pictures. It's actually a very fun and easy technique, so let's jump right in. All right friends, welcome back to another lesson in Lightroom. Let's jump right in here. Now, if you will recall from our previous lesson, we took 3 bracketed RAW files and we used them to create one super RAW file, which gave us access to an enormous amount of exposure data. Let's do a quick little recap here. In our first image, we exposed for the sky. This image is a little bit dark. As we move up, we have an image which more or less exposes for midtones, so we can start to see our landscape. And then as we move to the right, once again, we can see we have a slightly brighter exposure, which gives us even more dynamic range in some of the landscape. Now, we were able to smush all of these 3 files together to create one super RAW file, which again gave us an enormous amount of access to all of that raw data. And it allows us to create a very beautifully balanced exposure equation. We demonstrated that this process is actually quite easy, but the fun does not stop here because this single image is actually part of a larger panoramic. As we mentioned when we were on location, the San Juan Mountains lend themselves beautifully to gigantic, wide panoramic compositions. There's actually a lot more beautiful stuff happening to the left and to the right of this particular image. This is just the center of the panoramic. So what we want to do in this lesson is take our super raw file editing capabilities one step farther and generate a series of these guys right here that we can then use to create a larger panoramic. Okay, let's get started. I'm going to jump over here. Now, these are all of the raw bracketed files that I shot in order to create this panoramic. So over on the left, we have our darker images, and as we move across, the brackets get a little bit brighter in succession. Each of these rows represents a unique image in the panorama. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through each of these and we're going to create a gigantic raw file out of this row and then another gigantic raw file out of this row and so forth until we have all 5 super raw files that it's going to take to build out our panorama. So let's get started. We can begin right here at the very top. When I look at this image, I see that I do in fact have a really good sky. So this image is properly exposed for the sky, but once again, look at how dark everything is down here on the landscape. If you will recall from the last lesson, we determined that the sunlight is hitting the clouds directly and that there is a massive cloud somewhere up there in the sky that's blockading the landscape from receiving any direct sunlight. So what we need to do here is balance this exposure equation using our brackets. So I'm going to hit the B key and send this first image to the quick collection. And as we move over to the right, I'm seeing some pretty good looking midtones here. So I'm going to hit the B key once more. And as we move over, okay, we've got some pretty big exposure burnouts going on this very last one, so I don't think we're going to use that. But let me back up one more. I like what I'm seeing down here in these red shrubs. I'm getting a lot of good midtones and a lot of colors coming out down here in the bottom, so I'm going to keep this image as well. All right, now let's go to our quick collection. And as you can see, we have isolated 3 images out of our bracketed series that we can use to compile a gigantic super raw file. So once again, let's select all these images. I'm going to right click, go to photo merge, and we're going to select HDR for high dynamic range. All right, and Lightroom generates this little dialog box, which is pretty cool. Right now there's a checkbox that says auto align. I'm just going to leave that on. These images were in fact shot on a tripod, so they should all be compositionally identical, but Lightroom can still maybe do a little bit of nudging to make sure that they are in fact perfectly lined up. So let's go down and hit merge. All right, so Lightroom then goes to work cooking these images into its gigantic raw oven, and it spits out what we see here. Okay, I have number 1, number 3, and number 4. These are my original files, my original assets that I used to generate number 2 right here. So this file is our super raw file. Now, right now it kind of looks like all the other ones, but that's just because we have not really unlocked its potential. So I'm going to move this over to the edge here. We'll double click and let's drop into our development module. Okay, so now in theory, this super raw file should give us access to all of the data. When we come down here, it should give us access to all of this data, all of this data, all of this data. So we're now looking at, I would say, anywhere from 5 to 6 stops of dynamic range, which is way more than any single raw file can do from my particular camera. Again, people love to brag about their cameras. Oh, I've got 12 stops of dynamic range and so forth. And that's fine if you do. But I can tell you that even if I had a camera which claimed to have 12 stops of dynamic range, I would still bracket every single one of my files, just because it doesn't hurt to be safe. No matter where I go, I always have more than enough data to create giant, beautiful images out of almost any exposure equation. All right, so speaking of super raw files, let's get this baby in the oven. All right, first things first, the sky is most assuredly blown out pretty good. So let's grab our highlights and bring them down and try to recover that sky. That looks pretty good right there. All right, now as you will recall in our previous lesson, we used Lightroom's powerful local adjustments in order to bring this image to life, because there are in fact a bunch of different exposure zones which are slightly different. And I think it's going to be pretty difficult for us to use the master overall sliders over here in order to really balance this lighting equation. So I'm going to do just like we did in the last episode. I'm going to start in with my circular neutral density filter, and I'm going to come down in here to these beautiful red shrubs that we see, and I'm going to start working this image up in sort of one section at a time. So first things first, I like that this can come up a little bit. So let's access some of that big, beautiful raw data. Let's make this guy a little bit bigger down here, get him in the corner. Alrighty, so this section needs to come up a little bit. Let's move our highlights up actually. Let's move our whites up. Shadows can come down, blacks can come down. That gives us a nice contrast. We'll actually bring this exposure up even a little bit more. That looks good there. And I'd like to warm this up using some color temperature, and I want to add a little splash of red tint to really celebrate all of that beautiful, vibrant red-orange color that we see down here. All right, that's a good start. Next, let's grab another one. I'm looking at this big forest of aspen trees right over here on this side. I want to target that zone. Again, this is part of the landscape, which is drastically darker than the sky, so we need to make this a little bit brighter. So let's bring our exposure up here, make this guy a little bit bigger, move him over there so that he can kind of get into that side. All right, exposure up, that looks good. I'm gonna warm this up a little bit as well because there's a lot of yellow in here. That looks nice. Let's bring our highlights up, shadows down, whites up, maybe a little bit more, that's good. And blacks can come down just a little bit so that we can keep some of that contrast in between the trees. All right, that looks like a pretty nice edit there. Next, we're looking at this section over here in the valley. Let's just kind of make a nice large section for the valley. We'll move him around. He definitely needs to be brighter because the valley is much darker than the rest of our image. And as we bring this up, I can really start to see some of those colors coming out of the valley. Again, slightly warmer, don't want to overdo that too much. Highlights up, shadows down, whites come up, blacks go down. Maybe another tiny little splash right there. Okay, now I'm looking at this sort of section right up here. The trees up here are looking a little bit dark to me, as is the transition of the forest over into the mountain. So let's do one more, make kind of a long, skinny guy, and let's move him right into this section here. And I just want to kind of raise the exposure up just a little bit right through there. That looks nice. And let's try to contrast that up a little bit as well with some whites and some shadows. All right, very, very good. Okay, the next thing I think I'm feeling is probably a graduated neutral density filter that's going to kind of take care of our sky a little bit. So I'm going to bring this guy right down through here. Again, I'm just trying to target the sky. I feel like the sky is still ever so slightly overexposed, so I want to bring the exposure down just a couple tiny little ticks. If we go too far, then we're obviously overdoing that edit, but I just want to bring this down just a little bit right there. Again, the highlights need to come down just a splash because the clouds are suffering from some exposure burnouts. That looks pretty good right there. Okay, let's close this up. And now, as you can see, just in a few short minutes with a few quick edits, we have more or less balanced the exposure equation from this image. If we go back and look once again at our original raw files, we can see here that as it was originally shot, the sky is substantially brighter than the landscape. And as we move up through our brackets, we get brighter in our landscape, but we start to overexpose our sky. And then in the brightest exposure, we can see that this is really, really drastic. So again, we've used a couple of local edits along with our super raw file production in order to create a beautifully exposed equation. The sky now matches the landscape. Okay, now that we have used localized edits in order to kind of balance out all of the different exposure regions of this, I think it's time that we go back into our primary editor and let's look at kind of building this up on the larger scale at this point. So I can move my exposure up and down, and everything is more or less even at this point. So exposure, I'm going to say it needs to come up 0.25. That looks pretty good. I'm going to bring my shadows down just a tick. I'm going to bring my whites up, blacks go down. Again, this is helping to provide a little bit of extra contrast. And as we come down here, I'm going to add 7 points of vibrance and 7 points of color saturation. Again, I take every opportunity that I possibly can to say, do not overdo your color saturation. This is the biggest amateur trick in the book. It's easy to look at this and say, oh, I love that fiery red bush. Don't do it. Don't fall into that trap. Keep your edits nice and subtle. We want to stay within the realm of reality. Even as little as we've saturated this image right now, it's still very, very, very color saturated. All right, let's come down in here. I'm going to create a quick tonal curve. I'm going to go up 5 points on my highlights. I'm going to go up 4 on my whites, and we're just going to reverse that, -4 on our darks, -5 on our shadows. That gives us a little extra punch of contrast, and as you can see, it's already looking nice and contrasty. All right, our luminance curve in our HSL tonal curve selection. Let's go into luminance. I'm still looking at that sky, and it looks a little bit too bright to me. I want to bring some dark, rich blues into that sky. Now again, you have to be very careful. Don't overdo it, because if you start dragging these sliders all the way to the maximum, then you get a really, really fake looking image. So subtlety is key. So my blue slider, he's going to come down, I don't know, call it 17 points. That looks pretty good right there. All right, the next thing that I'm seeing in this image is we have a beautiful patch of green aspen trees that haven't really started turning for their fall colors right here in the center. Now the thing about green and yellow is that they're actually somewhat close on the color spectrum when it comes to the way that digital camera sensors sort of interpret color. And greens tend to have actually a lot of yellow in them. And so what we want to do here is I want to go over to my hue slider, and I can target my greens, but I can also target my yellows. Let's first off start by targeting our greens. And if I move my greens off to the right, watch what happens. I get a whole lot of really, really strong separation from green to yellow. Now again, this is overdoing it. This looks like a ridiculous Instagram filter. But again, when I target my greens and I move them ever so slightly to the right, let's see what happens when we move our greens to the left first. See how they become very, very yellow? Basically what that means is that the sensor, the camera sensor, has baked a lot of yellow into those green tones. And what I want to do is I want to add some separation. I want my greens to be really green, and I want them to stand out. So take my green slider on the hue tab and I move that over. Let's call it 18 points. Let's keep it subtle. That looks pretty good right there. I've definitely created a very strong separation between our greens and our yellow trees. All right, so in just a few clicks, you can see that we have generated a rather beautiful super raw file. Let's go back up to the top here. I'm seeing one more thing that I want to look at. I'm going to grab another circular neutral density filter, and I am going to come down in here and ever so slightly try to punch up a little extra red in these red bushes, because I want to give them some strong separation from the rest of the yellow trees. It was a very fiery red bush, and in this case I don't want to overdo it, but I do again want to really try to celebrate that color shift. So again, extra color right there, a little bit of extra tint right there. I can move in, let's go highlights up a little bit, shadows down, too much, easy there, easy boy. Whites come up, blacks maybe down just a tad, and let's see here. We've got our color saturation tab that was sort of preloaded at 18%. That might be a little bit strong, so I'm going to back that off, call that right about, and let's just go with 10. All right, so that gives us a lot of extra red down here in this corner. This corner is going to really anchor this side of the panoramic image, and it's going to look quite lovely once we're done. All right, so let's close that up. And as you can see, with just a few quick edits, we have taken 3 unique raw files, smushed them together, and accessed the power of all of that exposure data to create one super raw file, which we are able to beautifully balance. All right, so as we look at our files here, again, these are the source materials. We have a dark exposure, a midtone, and a brighter exposure that ultimately get us to this gigantic, beautiful, super raw file. Now, next, what we need to do is go back to all of our bracketed panels, which we have right here. And we need to use each one of these rows to generate its own super raw file. And once we have all of our super raw files, we can then put those into a beautiful panoramic image. Now, in the interest of saving time on this tutorial, I'm going to go ahead and cut right here, and I will make sure that I generate all of our beautiful super raw files so that when we come right back, we'll have a series of beautiful super raw files lined up for our panoramic, which is the next step. So now that you get the basic idea about how to generate a super raw file, I think that should probably do it for this part of the tutorial. So let's do a quick cut and we'll see you in just a second. Alright friends, welcome back. Like I said, through the magic of video production, we have skipped ahead. I have taken the liberty to go through all of these raw assets and generate 4 final super raw files. Now I've done this using the techniques that we have been discussing in this episode. Each of these super raw files is essentially a composite of 3 raw images, giving us a huge amount of dynamic range. And as we can see, when we take a look at these images, we just have a beautifully exposed, properly balanced image as we go from left to right. You can actually see the panoramic starting to take shape here. This is the left side of the scene. Here we come through the middle, and then we finish off over on the right side. Okay, so now that we have these 4 beautiful raw assets, we need to combine them into the final panoramic. Now, fortunately, Lightroom does have a way to do that as well. I'm going to select each of these. We'll do a quick right click, photo merge, and I'm going to select panorama. Once again, we get our little dialog box right here. As you can see on the fringes of this image, we've got a little bit of warping taking place. This is basically Lightroom manipulating each of the 4 panels in order to merge them seamlessly together. So let's grab our boundary warp, move that all the way to the right, and select merge. Now, this is a point where we want to start managing our expectations. I've often said that I don't really like allowing the computer to do my creative thinking for me. On the one hand, you can say it's easier to work smarter and allow the computer to merge your images together. But on the other hand, we need to be a little bit careful what we wish for. So, Lightroom has now generated a panoramic image based on the 4 super raw files that we gave to it. And when I click on this image, I can see that I'm sorta back to where I started. This is definitely not what I would have expected. When we drop into our development module, we can see that Lightroom has already taken the liberty of adjusting quite a few of these parameters in order to match the tonality that allows these images to come together. This is, however, somewhat disappointing because I feel like we've gone right back to our original raw format. The image is kind of flat and gray, there's no color saturation, and it leaves me wondering, how did we get this out of these super beautiful bright images? Let's move this guy over here. Because as I go through these images, I have a beautifully exposed, bright, colorful image, and that's the same as I come through each one of my raw files. But then after Lightroom gets done smushing these beautiful images together, I feel like I'm kind of right back at this. I feel like we're kind of right back to an original raw file. Yes, it is a beautifully stitched panorama, but there's still a lot of disappointment going on here. Why did I just do all of that work balancing my 4 raw photos in order to come back to this drab looking image here? Well, let's see if we can bring some of this back together. Right now, it looks like things are a little dark, so we're once again coming in and grabbing a couple of adjustments here. We warm things up, bring up our exposure, and we are coming back into this section here. Highlights go up, shadows go down, whites go up, blacks go down. Let's do another one right through here. And once again, exposure comes up, a little bit of contrast, highlights up, shadows down, whites up, blacks down. Increase exposure a little bit more there. Close this off. Let's roll through some extra color saturation just to get that up and running. And then in our luminance tab, once again, let's bring our blues down. Okay, now at this point, I feel like this image is starting to look like something that really got pushed too far. We've got some weird hyper color saturation going on, and the tonality is just still a little bit dark and drab. I've also lost all of these highlights that we were able to recover in the clouds over here. I imagine that we can probably try to bring some of this stuff back, but again, this is where I believe that we need to manage our expectations with regard to automation. As I've said in the past, I am a huge advocate of hand blending these items together in Photoshop. That way you don't get any surprises. Now, I would consider this to be a moderately acceptable image, but it still isn't really as exciting as I would have thought. And as such, I took the liberty of going back through and hand stitching all of these images together in Photoshop. And when we look at that image, I feel like we get a much more beautiful representation of how this scene actually should look. Let's throw this one into the quick collection and look at Lightroom's automation versus Photoshop. So this is what we have automatically generated in Lightroom, and as I move over one image, this is what I was able to hand blend in Photoshop. I feel like the Photoshop image just has a little bit more character to it. I have a beautiful amount of separation between my reds over here and my yellows over here. This ridge line just has a lot of contrast. It was able to kind of retain all of that beautiful contrast that we generated from those original super raw files. When I go back to the Lightroom version, everything just looks a little bit muddy and smushed and flattened together. And again, this is where we need to manage our expectations with regard to automation. When we relinquish control to the computer to make creative decisions for us, we have to be prepared for what I would consider to be an inferior image. Let's look at the Photoshop version one more time. Again, we just have this beautiful crisp tonality. There's extra sharpness involved because I was able to go in and hand blend some sharpness into the file. All the highlights in my sky have remained recovered because I was able to use those original raw files. We have beautiful colors throughout the trees, the mountain, the sunbeam on the mountain just has its own beautiful quality that we very carefully built into our original raw files. And again, when we look back at the newly generated panoramic from Lightroom, everything just looks really smushed together. So essentially we come to a bit of a creative crossroads. If the automatically generated file from Lightroom is satisfactory to you in your workflow, then I would consider this to be an acceptable enough image to place into your portfolio. But if you really want to go the extra mile, let's look back at Photoshop. I gotta say, this is just a vastly superior product. It takes a lot of extra time to go into Photoshop and hand blend these images together, but that's okay. Because in my personal opinion, the extra work that you put into your images really pays you back tenfold. When we look at these two images side by side, there's no doubt in my mind that the hand blended Photoshop image, which is what we're looking at right now, is vastly superior to the automatically generated thing that we got from Lightroom. Now, the automatically generated image from Lightroom is really pretty good. And unless we had a basis of comparison, most people would say, wow, that's a beautiful image. But when we do see these images side by side, back to Photoshop, I gotta say, Photoshop takes the winning cake every single time in my mind. So as we look back over the journey that it took to get to these two images, we have once again our beautifully balanced super raw files. I think the most exciting part of this process is that these images are really quite easy to come by, and that the automation tools that Lightroom has does allow us to create really exceptional building blocks. Each of these super raw files is an excellent asset that we can use to drop into Photoshop and hand blend our panorama. And even better, each of these super raw files is actually quite easy to build, as we saw in this lesson. So as we toggle through these images here, then we look at our Lightroom mashup, and then we look at our Photoshop mashup. I think Photoshop is definitely the clear winner, but if I'm being perfectly honest, the process that we took to get to this section is really a winning workflow. I'm loving the way that we can bring these super raw files together to generate these assets. And in the next lesson, we will go into Photoshop and I will show you exactly how to hand blend these 4 images together to give us this superior product. All right, friends, well, I'm sure that the debate between automation and hand blending will continue to rage on. I will always stay on the side of hand blending, but if automation is what floats your boat, looking at this Lightroom image, I imagine that we could probably do a couple more raw edits in here to really kind of bring this image back to life. And if you are all about automation, then this is definitely an excellent process for you to build into your digital workflow. So in the next lesson, we will jump into Photoshop and I will show you exactly how to hand blend this image together to give what I consider to be a vastly superior product. So thank you so much for sticking through it. We've gone through a lot of topics in this particular lesson and I can't wait to move on into the next lesson. So we'll see you very soon.